Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 63. Today, I'm going to explore the world of fungal ecology by talking about all of the symbiotic relationships that fungi have with other life forms, and more generally, about how fungi manipulate the world around them to promote life, to promote habitable, biotic-friendly conditions. However, understand that fungi aren't just good characters. They're not all sunshine and rainbows. With the very same physiological qualities that make them such good symbiotes, fungi can also be very effective parasites. Where they can promote the growth of other life forms, they can just as easily discourage growth or hurt other life forms. If you've just finished listening to episode 62, then you should remember that fungi evolved the ability to break down lignin as part of their search for cellulose. While the individual fungi were only concerned for their immediate food needs, on an evolutionary timescale, the unconscious ecological consequence was the return of massive amounts of carbon back into the carbon cycle. This promoted a density and complexity of life on Earth that would not exist at all in its present form had the fungi taken another 100 or 200 million years or something to evolve to break down lignin. All that carbon that they would have broken down would instead have become locked in coal deposits and fossils deep underground. From our modern perspective, looking back in time, this evolutionary event was extremely important, as it had major consequences for the subsequent evolution and diversification of all life. Just to reiterate, the fungi literally released enough carbon back into the atmosphere and back into the carbon cycle to sustain the density of biomass that existed forever after. Without this, the world might never have experienced large, dense jungles, or dinosaurs that reached the size that they did. The world might never have given rise to humans, having lacked the carbon necessary for a global ecology capable of supporting such large, energy-expensive organisms. In this way, the fungi have had a subtle but extremely influential and powerful role in supporting life on Earth. This is a theme that's going to continually be popping up this episode, how fungi have mutualistically integrated themselves, ecologically and symbiotically, into the world around them to a degree that few other organisms can rival. It's important to understand just how diverse fungi really are. They exist almost everywhere, even in places that you would think would be impossible. In the previous episodes, I talked about fungus needing certain environments to live in and to thrive. I generally talked about fungi preferring moist, shady areas and warmer temperatures for their metabolism and their growth. However, life is not so monolithic. Fungi have adapted to a huge range of habitats outside of these boundaries, with many that seem to defy understanding. Although you'll pretty much always find fungus in the wet undergrowth of a tropical forest, you'll also find fungus in the desert, having dark tissues coated with melanin to protect them from the sun's radiation. You'll find dried out husks of hyphaea that insulate them from the heat and the water loss. Some fungi that express melanin have even adapted to be able to capture ionizing radiation, which can create a change in the electron spin resonance of the melanin and make it a more efficient reducer of NADH. The end result? The fungal cell grows faster because they can chemically process energy way more efficiently. This little trick with ionizing radiation has allowed fungi to colonize Arctic and Antarctic habitats, where the background UV radiation is typically much higher than average. When I talked about saprophytic digestion in the last episode, I mentioned that one of the environmental constraints is the presence of molecular oxygen. Saprophytic digestion is an aerobic process. It requires oxygen, so where there is none, if it's an anoxic environment, fungi typically won't be able to dissolve their food to get nutrients. However, not all fungi use this saprophytic method, and they've adapted to live in marine environments with relatively low amounts of molecular oxygen. Some fungus live in extreme proximity to water, perhaps requiring a standing body of water and partial submersion at all times. Or perhaps they're like chytrids and they have some or all of their life cycle where they're just a single zoospore floating through the water. I mean, this shouldn't be too surprising, considering that fungi are believed to have originated in a marine environment around 1 billion years ago, and they have since evolved and adapted to spread across dry land. In extreme cases, fungi have been found in sediments and near hydrothermal vents that exist at the bottom of the ocean, where the pressures and the temperatures are often extreme. While most fungus live on dry land, feeding off of dead animals and plants, the fungi as a kingdom have the genetic and the physiological capacity to live in almost every environment. This is one similarity that fungi share with mammals, specifically with rodents, who are a group of mammals that have spread to virtually every environment on Earth that isn't considered literally extreme, like inside of a volcano, or at the bottom of the Dead Sea, or in a deep-sea hydrothermal vent, or somewhere else that's equally inhospitable to all but the hardiest microorganisms. This wide variety of habitats also means that fungi can integrate macroscopic biology into almost every habitat, which will then have profound effects on the inanimate matter that exists there, as well as the life that will come after the fungus to maybe colonize the area because of the changes that the fungus created. For example, Hyphaea can grow into extremely tiny cracks and pores in the rock. They chase after water that may have drained down inside these grains or these cracks or pores or whatever. The accumulated growth of the Hyphaea can then split and break apart the rocks. This happens very slowly, but as the growth of the Hyphaea accumulates, the pressure builds up, and the fungal growth will eventually dissolve the rock beneath it into gravel and sand. Naturally, these softer, finer materials with better water drainage and aeration than just solid rock offer a suitable substrate for all manner of plants and burrowing animals to come move in. Consider another example. Consider the riparian zone, or the forests and vegetation that lives along the banks of a river. Here, along the edges of a river, all of the dead and the decaying plant matter from trees, ferns, shrubs, grasses, and whatever else that happen to live there, this will all get dissolved and consumed by the fungus. The fungal metabolic activity here will release nutrients into the water, because it's not a very clean process of breaking these organisms down extracellularly. The fungi just exude all of these digestive chemicals and they break down their biological substrate, the detritus, and they absorb what they can, but what they can't absorb will often get washed away or drained away, and in this case, it'll run into the river water. What this means is that their metabolic activity will release the nutrients into the water and fertilize it for all of the aquatic plants, animals, and microbes that live there. More free nutrients supports more growth at the primary level, which then supports secondary, tertiary, quaternary, etc. levels of the ecology. In every soil environment, from the riparian zone along the banks of a river to the shadows of a jungle under canopy, to a wide, dry expanse of open grassland, fungi play a critical role in nutrient cycling in every place, in every habitat. By dissolving dead matter, they release the nutrients in that biomass back into the soil. This goes for pretty much every nutrient, be it phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, sulfur, you name it. This perpetual reinvigoration of the soil promotes the growth of plants and soil microbes that can utilize these nutrients for their own growth. Furthermore, there's a whole world of symbiotic relationships that exists between fungus and plants, but I'll get to that in a few minutes. Fungi do a huge amount of the chemical legwork needed to keep nutrients cycling through the biosphere. Much of this work involves chemical activity that's been shaped and finely tuned by selective forces for countless generations. It's evolutionarily sophisticated. But fungi also provide a much more basic, much more rudimentary service to their local ecosystems. Because they are themselves also organisms with biomass and nutrients, they are food for other organisms that will just come by and simply consume the mycelium. Insects, slugs and snails, fish, and even mammals like caribou are all known to be regular consumers of fungus. Caribou specifically eat a form of fungus called lichen, which is abundant pretty much everywhere, but it's an especially common item in the boreal north, in the taiga and the tundra where the caribou live. Lichen is called a composite organism, which is an organism that's literally composed of multiple different individual species. The lichen is the growth form that appears when these species grow intertwined at a microscopic cellular level. Lichen are endlessly fascinating for many reasons, one of which being that a lichen growth form is distinct from the individual growth form of each symbiont species. To be more exact, lichen is the symbiotic growth form of two or more fungus, combined with a species of algae or cyanobacteria. In the lichen relationship, all of these individual component species are called symbionts. The fungus, or the multiple fungi that are in the lichen, are called the mycobiont, or the mycobionts, individually, and this just means the fungal symbiont. Now, the other symbiont is a photosynthetic species, which is called the photobiont. If the photobiont is an algae, then this is specifically called the phycobiont, where phyco is a prefix for plants, or plant-like, phyto, phyco, that kind of thing. If the photobiont is a cyanobacteria, in contrast, then it's called a cyanobiont. Okay, but enough with the vocab words. The lichen symbiosis first formed when some fungi and some photobionts began to work together to share nutrients. Each symbiont has its own morphological, physiological qualities that allow it to optimize for certain tasks. For example, the photobiont is photosynthetic, and that's hugely valuable. It means that it's able to consume carbon dioxide and water and light energy to produce molecular oxygen and various sugars. Sugars are the important thing that the fungus cares about, because the fungus feeds off of some of these sugars to sustain its own body and to fuel its growth. Because the fungus isn't breaking down plants or animals to get carbon saprophytically, it has to get its carbon from the photobiont that it cradles in its thousands of arms of hyphaea. Now, in return for these sugars, the fungus uses its hyphaea to grow outwards and explore the substrate around them. The hyphaea have an extremely high surface area, and this makes them very absorptive of water and mineral nutrients. Much of this water is then supplied to the photobiont to allow it to continue conducting photosynthesis. Minerals like phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium are also shared between mycobiont and photobiont so as to support the production of DNA and the activity of enzymes. On a cellular level, the hyphaea of the fungus form a superfine tangled mesh, characterized by heavy anastomosis, with the individual cells of algae or cyanobacteria getting wrapped up and secured by all of these interlocking hyphaea. The hyphaea grow densely to produce sheets that form a cortex, or an outer skin for the lichen. This is usually, it's typically very thin and delicate, but when you compare it to the molecular scale structures of the lichen and their internal physiology, it's a pretty dense little sheet of skin. Now, within the internal space created by this sheet of skin, stuff inside the lichen is a little more loosely organized. The photobiont, for example, is held suspended by the entangling hyphaea, which reach inwards from the inner surface of the skin to share nutrients with all of the photobionts that are, being strung up everywhere. The fungi will also produce structures that wrap around the photobiont cells and puncture them to create channels for mass nutrient exchange. These are often specific to the lichen growth form, and they don't appear or get expressed in related fungus that aren't lichenized. Some lichen fungi, like the basidiolichens, are known to try to create mushroom structures that resemble the mushrooms produced by other Basidiomycetes fungi, but their attempted lichen mushrooms are altered and strange. The presence of the photobiont in this otherwise fungal tissue induces chemical and physiological variables that make for a kind of weird mutant mushroom. Sometimes the photobionts are arranged under the cortex in a layer of their own, called a symbiont layer, and beneath this is a relatively open space called the medulla, where the hyphaea are packed the least densely. Along the substrate, or the physical surface that the lichen is growing on, there might be a thicker layer of hyphal tissue which creates rhizomes that act like miniature roots or rhizoids. They don't absorb nutrients like roots do, but they do anchor the lichen to its substrate and keep it mechanically stable, so it won't blow around. The lichen, which is kind of like a biological textile almost, grows into dense tissue that can take several different forms, depending on the various fungal and algal or bacterial species that make up the lichen. Some of the more common growth forms of lichen are called foliose or fruticose growth forms, which are general morphological terms that are used to describe various shapes. For example, a foliose growth form, and this exists in all manner of organisms beyond lichen, a foliose growth form involves structures that look like little lobes or little small round leaves, and in the case of lichen, they expand outwards, growing two-dimensionally over the surface of a rock or a tree. Now on the other hand, a fruticose growth form is three-dimensional. It grows to look like a miniaturized stem of a tree or a shrub, sans leaves. Another common growth form is called crustose, where the lichen grows as a thick, dense crust over its substrate, and this crust can crack or bend and warp in a way that looks remarkably similar to peeling paint. There are a number of other lichen growth forms, but for the sake of brevity, I won't list them all off. But just know that these growth forms aren't hard categories or hard definitions, as lichen growth patterns often exhibit a blend of one or more of these individual types of growth forms. Lichen are just really neat, because they can live in a huge variety of places, just like the fungus symbionts that compose them. Because they're photosynthetic, thanks to the photobiont, they just need access to sunlight, water, and air to acquire their carbon. However, they don't produce roots, so their rate of nutrient uptake is generally pretty low. Even though the hyphaea have a really high surface area, the actual growth of the hyphaea is itself relatively slow, especially compared to non-lichenized fungi. Their slow growth rate can be measured in millimeters per year. Lichen can grow on things like rocks or tree bark, but they don't actively tap those substrates for nutrients. They just grow on them, using them as a literal surface to live on, just like how you walk along your carpet or the sidewalk or whatever. It's common to see crustose lichen growing on rocks. In the case of endolithic lichen, they literally grow within the rock, between the literal mineral grains that exist on a molecular level. Other lichens grow on leaves, or on or in or under the bark of a tree, often growing as an epiphyte on the trunk or out on the branches. In some cases, which is pretty common with fruticose lichen, it might be attached to the substrate at just a single point, and its growth form takes its body radiating away from that one point, like a miniature version of a tree stem that branches and grows up and away from the ground. Then there are lichens called vagrant lichens, and those are the ones that aren't attached to any substrate whatsoever. These will just get blown around by the wind or the rain or gravity or whatever, and they'll find nutrients and water wherever they happen to go. Now might be a good time to mention that, unlike regular fungus, lichens are often drought resistant, and they can go dormant and weather arid conditions far longer and far better than any fungus could that isn't involved in a lichen symbiosis. Lichens also have tremendous ecological value. They're called pioneering organisms because they're often the first species to invade a new or an emptied habitat and colonize it, and alter that habitat in a way that makes it more conducive for other life to come in later and live there too. For example, lichens will release chelating chemicals like metal oxalates, where they can chemically break down solid rock into individual mineral particles and dusts and powders and sands and stuff. This creates very rudimentary soils. The soil is made of particles, and particles can be moved around and dug into. You can burrow into a substrate full of little loose particles. You can't burrow into solid rock. Naturally, this will invite animals like mammals and lizards that can now come and burrow into the ground and use the soil as like a habitat or a nest. The soil can now also absorb and hold water, and plants can dig their roots through the loose soil to find that water. Furthermore, these sandy soils, as well as the sands of larger deserts, can be colonized by lichen that will then help stabilize the soil and prevent it from washing out in the rain or by being rapidly degraded by the wind. This soil stability further promotes plant growth and encourages mammals and insects and reptiles and whatnot to burrow into the soil, because if the soil is more stable, then it's safer for the animals. It's easier for them to create larger tunnel networks and larger burrows without having all of the dirt around them just collapse in on them. In the case of vascular plants, many species of them can't grow very well in loose, insecure soil like you would find, in your typical sand dune. And so the presence of lichen with their soil stabilizing effects can actually encourage vascular plants to come in and colonize the habitat. So not only do lichen create the soil and stabilize the soil and make it this prime spot for all of these other organisms, lichen can also indirectly fertilize the soil by being the literal food that gets consumed by other organisms and then pooped out. Snails, for example, will eat lichen and then produce nitrogen-rich feces that it releases in a trail behind it. The snail poop then breaks down in the rain, and the nitrogen gets washed out into the soil. Lichens are even involved with air quality. As they have no cuticles or stomata or any other part of a plant that would allow it to regulate the air coming into its tissues, the lichen's body tends to be chemically representative of the environment around it. They can be described as biomonitors of their local habitat. For example, if it's humid in the air, then the lichen is typically well hydrated. If it's dry out, then the lichen is typically dry. If there's more of one gas than another in the air, this gas content might be represented in the lichen. This also applies to pollution. Pollution, like smog or smoke, is absorbed across their entire bodies through diffusion, which can then accumulate in the lichen's tissues. Because lichen grow slowly and they don't rapidly process a lot of nutrients or chemical energy at any one time, exposure to pollution can potentially throw them out of whack and ruin the lichen symbiosis. It can crack apart that symbiotic relationship of all the constituent symbiont species. Alright, but enough about lichen. I mean, they're really cool, they're really interesting, but they're still just small, flat growths on rocks and trees. Other life forms are certainly a lot bigger, more dynamic, and just by their raw size, are certainly more influential on the local ecology than lichen. I'm thinking of organisms like trees and other plants. Plants define life on our planet in many ways, from being the primary producers that turn light energy from the sun into chemical energy for animals to consume, to creating physical habitats with their bodies that other animals or plants can use or live in, like birds, lizards, squirrels, all manner of insects, as well as epiphytes and parasitic plants. The list really goes on. Plants like trees are just incredibly valuable organisms, and yet their global distribution and their vitality is not due solely to these uber qualities of the plant. Many plant species, including a lot of trees, actually depend on symbiotic relationships with fungus in order to sustain themselves and stay alive. Many plants and trees, like those in the orchid family, can't grow or maintain their bodies at all without the nutrient benefits that they get from their symbiotic relationship with fungus. The fungus in this kind of symbiosis is called a mycorrhizal fungus. The tree, or the plant, is a mycorrhizal plant. The whole relationship is just called a mycorrhiza. It's a mycorrhizal symbiote. To summarize the general concept here, the mycorrhizal fungus integrates itself into the roots of the vascular plant, and together, plant and fungus share the nutrients that they are best optimized at acquiring. This integration takes place on a cellular or even an intracellular level. The basic gist of the mycorrhizal relationship is similar to that involved in lichen, and for the same reasons. The plant is photosynthetic, and so it uses its photosynthetic tissues, like its leaves, to produce sugars. As much as 30% of these plant-produced sugars are given to the fungus, in return for water and mineral nutrients. Naturally, the fungus isn't photosynthetic, And if it's not going to predominantly be breaking down detritus saprophytically, then it has to get its carbon from somewhere else, and it does so through the sugar water in the phloem of a tree. Conversely, the fungus has a stupidly huge surface area, because of all of the uncountable billions and trillions of hyphae that are crawling and penetrating through the soil. This surface area makes the fungus way better at finding and absorbing water than the plant is. Furthermore, even though the fungus aren't getting most of their carbon through saprotrophism, they're still secreting organic acids and other corrosive chemicals out of their membranes and into the surrounding environment. This will corrode rock and other biological material littered through the substrate, and this will create free-floating minerals, which can then be readily absorbed and handed off to the plant. There are a few types of mycorrhizal fungi, categorized based on the cellular strategy that they have for invading the plant's roots. The two main types are the endomycorrhiza and the ectomycorrhiza. Endo is a prefix meaning within, while ecto is a prefix meaning outside, and this adequately summarizes their strategies. The endomycorrhizal fungi will grow to penetrate the plant's roots, and then they'll penetrate the cell walls of the plant cells themselves, protruding their hyphae into the cytoplasm within. Inside the root cell, the hyphae will form a tangled ball, or a mass, that's called an arbuscule. This arbuscule is like a little globular-shaped concentration of hyphae that has a very high surface area, and so they act as internal points of nutrient exchange within the plant. The fungus can deliver its absorbed minerals directly into the plant cells, and the plant can give its sugars directly into the fungus. Because of the intimate placement of the arbuscules deep inside the cells of the root tissue, you can see how this mechanism can potentially be exploited by parasitic fungus. Something kind of funny is that while there are numerous fungi that parasitize plants, there are also plants that parasitize fungi. These are still called mycorrhizal relationships, but they're specifically called monotropoid mycorrhiza because it's not a mutualist relationship. In this case, the plant parasitizes the fungus for its carbon. Having these arbuscules and other hyphaeal structures deep inside of the plant's root cells also helps with nitrogen fixation. Not many plants, almost no plants, can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and yet nitrogen is a really important nutrient for them to have. There are several species of bacteria and fungus that can fix nitrogen, and many of these species have formed symbiotic relationships with plants to share that nitrogen with them in return for sugars. The chemical process for fixing nitrogen is anaerobic, which means it can get destroyed or ruined in the presence of oxygen. So when you have these arbuscules, or these, whatever fungal structure they happen to be inside of the root cells, they can fix nitrogen there while being isolated from all of the molecular oxygen that might throw that system out of balance. Now, the ectomycorrhiza, on the other hand, work somewhat differently. Although, depending on how you see it, it's just as invasive and just as intimate as endomycorrhiza. Instead of penetrating the plant cells and creating nutrient exchange sites inside the cytoplasm, the ectomycorrhiza will grow their hyphae in strands that creep along the outside of the cell walls, between the cell walls, basically flowing into the root and filling all of the spaces between the cells, like water in a river flowing between all of the rocks. This creates a subnetwork of mycelium within the root itself, called a Hardig net. This Hardig net grows along the outer cells within the root, creating a mycelial sheath. This sheath is integrated into the framework of root cells, which creates a massive interface for nutrient exchange. But it doesn't just end there. On the outer surface of the root, outside of both the cells and the root's, outer skin, the ectomycorrhizal fungus will also generate a larger exterior sheath that it calls a mantle. And this will cover up the root and all of its root hairs that the plant typically uses to help absorb water. However, to compensate for this problem, the fungus will extend its own hyphae in their place. There are a few other strategies for mycorrhizal symbiosis, like arbutoid mycorrhiza, which is kind of like ectomycorrhiza, except it also penetrates plant cells like endomycorrhiza, so it's like a combination of both methods. Then there's the ericoid mycorrhiza, which only lightly colonize the roots by dipping their hyphaea in a thin layer of the outermost cells. However, within these cells, the ericoid mycorrhizal fungi will form thick coils of hyphaea. I mentioned earlier how orchids can't grow at all without mycorrhizal fungi. These orchid plants typically use an endomycorrhizal strategy, where the mycobiont penetrates their cells and creates intracellular points of nutrient exchange. The mycorrhizal relationship offers numerous benefits to plants besides just the raw inputs that they need, like water and minerals. I mean, these are important, don't mistake that, but there are other organisms and other variables that are at play in the life of the plant, and the fungus helps moderate the impact of those variables. They help protect their symbiotic plant. For example, mycorrhizal fungi can help plants colonize nutrient-poor soils by using their hyphaea to absorb more nutrients than the tree would ever be able to absorb on its own, with its larger, thicker, clumsier, and more nutritionally expensive roots. In soils polluted with heavy metals, trees would normally be poisoned and killed by the metal toxins. However, trees engaged in a mycorrhizal symbiosis are much better able to withstand this pollution, as the fungus will selectively absorb the minerals it wants, while keeping excess metals or outright toxic chemicals on the outside of the mycelia. In this way, the tree mostly gets a healthy amount of metals, because the fungus is feeding it this controlled diet of nutrients that it knows the tree needs, in a healthy amount. And the tree can actually live pretty well. It might even thrive, despite the general toxicity of the soil all around it. Now, all of this is super useful and really amazing from a biological, ecological perspective, but the benefits don't stop here. Because the fungi are much more absorptive of water, they can also help plants survive droughts by reaching every little tiny bit of water that the plant root is just too coarse and would be unable to absorb or even find in the first place. Now, on the opposite end of the problem spectrum from a drought or from desiccation, you have flooding and high salinity water. And in this regard, fungus can also help plants survive these conditions too. They can help regulate the flow of salt ions into the root cells, and this protects the tree. The fungus can even help prevent diseases in the plants by helping regulate the soil and what kind of soil microbes can get near the plant's roots. All of these qualities, when you take them all into consideration, have made scientists think that plants would just not have been able to colonize dry land as rapidly as they did without the aid of fungus. Perhaps the wildest thing that I've ever read about mycorrhizal fungi is how they help defend plants against insects. By using their hybrid root mycelia networks, they can help generate and send signals between individual plants, warning them of the presence of an herbivore. Now, plants can do this on their own by sending out herbivore warning signals, which cause them to release a group of chemicals called volatile organic compounds. These volatile organic compounds are designed to attract predators of the herbivorous insect, so that they'll come by the area and then attack the herbivore and get that insect off of the plant. The warning signal is a kind of hormone released when the plant detects mechanical damage, like that caused by an herbivorous insect coming and chewing on a leaf. Now, typically, this hormone will circulate throughout the individual plant's body, and the affected plant cells within its body will produce the volatile compounds. However, when mycorrhizal fungi are growing in symbiosis with the plant's roots, the fungi are able to detect this signal, and they can amplify it. The hyphaea of individual mycelium will often meet and merge or mesh or otherwise chemically communicate in some way with the hyphaea of other fungal individuals. In this way, the mycorrhizal fungus create a huge, complex, underground biochemical communication network. One mycorrhiza can take this herbivore warning signal and propagate that signal to another fungus attached to another tree. And that tree will then begin producing the volatile organic compounds too, even though it may not have had any herbivores actively chewing on it. Sometimes one mycorrhizal fungi can be connected to multiple trees, and one signal from one tree will go through the fungus and make all the other trees activate their signals and their volatile compound production. In other cases, one tree can have multiple mycorrhizal fungi, and these can all relay the signal in different directions through the soil. The signal will radiate outwards, affecting numerous unafflicted trees, and this will create a widespread mass response. The mass response of all of these trees producing all of these volatile organic compounds produces a tremendous chemical signal for the herbivore's predators, and their abrupt appearance and predation of the herbivore will then protect the plant. Specifically, it protects the soft, photosynthetic leafy tissue that produces the sugar that the funguses need to eat. This underground network effect might seem to hugely benefit the trees, and it does. It really does. It protects the trees. But don't misunderstand the apparent altruism of this relationship. Keep in mind that the fungus is working to preserve the tissue that's used to produce its food. While fungus have evolved complex mutualist chemical relationships with algae, cyanobacteria, and vascular plants, they've also evolved mutualist relationships with insects. However, these relationships aren't based around a chemical integration of the fungus with its symbiont. Instead, the relationship is much more agricultural, like the relationship between humans and corn or wheat. This is because the insects in question will literally farm the mycelia for food. The mycelia cooperates with this farming because, as far as it's concerned, the insects are feeding it and protecting it. Various species of wood wasp are known to deposit their eggs into the wood of pine trees, along with the spores of the fungus Amylosterium areolatum. This fungus is able to digest wood, and as it does so, it will grow. As the fungi grows, the wasp larvae, who then hatch, will have a ready supply of nutritious food. The mother wood wasp is literally using the fungus as a dynamically growing baby food. A similar usage of fungus takes place with stingless bees and the Monascus fungus. As the bees make new nests and move from old nest to new one, they'll carry fungal spores and chunks of the mycelium with them to grow them in their new hive, as food for their larvae. Then there are the species of insect that literally cultivate fungus as if it was some kind of crop plant. They literally have fields of it that they'll harvest in pieces. In these cases, the insect literally helps plant and grow the fungus by actively feeding it and nurturing it and protecting it. And in return, the fungus allows the ants to eat a non-lethal portion of its newly grown biomass. Several species of ants are known to do this with fungi, as are African savanna termites, which grow their fungus in their termite mounds, and ambrosia beetles, which grow their funguses of choice in the bark of the trees that they live in. Fungus also grows within insects, in a symbiotic relationship that is much more chemical than agricultural. These fungi are typically yeasts, and they exist in the gut of insects, as individual cells, as microbes, where they help the insects break down and digest food, while shaving a very little bit of the nutrients off the top for themselves. This is just analogous to the bacteria in your gut, and in my gut, and every other human's gut, which we need to help us digest the food that we eat. Recall how I talked about how endomycorrhizal fungi have a strategic access point into a plant's body that allows them to be either very beneficial mutualists or very dangerous parasites? Fungi that have adapted to live inside of an insect's body are also subject to this dichotomy. Some of these fungi are beneficial as they help the insect digest its food, while others are parasitic and they hurt the insect and can even kill it by stealing its nutrients and growing within its body to devastating effect. This is the case for the Ophiocordyceps fungi, which are known to turn their insect hosts into zombies to help in the propagation of their reproduction. However, I'll get into this in more detail in the next episode, which will look explicitly at fungal reproduction. As for fungal ecology, well, I've only scratched the surface of this amazing aspect of fungal biology, but I've run out of time. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you found this information as mind-blowing and as wicked cool as I did. If you're enjoying this series exploring the kingdom fungi, then come back next week to learn how fungus reproduce and propagate themselves through time and space. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.